You remember the smell, not just the taste, the smell, walking into your mother's kitchen on a Sunday afternoon in the 1960s. And that golden, buttery warmth reaching out and wrapping around you before you even had a chance to take off your coat, before you set your bag down, before you said a word to anyone. The smell found you first. Maybe it was a pound cake sitting on the counter, still warm in its silver foil pan. Maybe it was a cheesecake cooling near the window, that faint smell of cream cheese and pastry drifting through the whole house like something out of a dream. And the remarkable thing, the thing that still feels like a small miracle when you think about it, is that nobody in your house had spent hours baking that morning. It came from the freezer. It came in a little aluminum pan. And it tasted like the finest bakery in the city had made it just for your family. That was the magic of Sara Lee. And for 30, 40, 50 years, that magic was real. It was consistent. Every single time you brought one of those silver pans home, you knew exactly what you were going to get. Not a guess. Not a hope. A certainty. In a world full of uncertainty, Sara Lee was something you could count on. And then, slowly, quietly, without any announcement or farewell, that certainty was taken away. Not stolen by a competitor. Not lost in a fire. Traded away in boardrooms by people who never once sat at a kitchen table and understood what they actually owned. This is the story of Sara Lee, the rise, the glory, and the long, heartbreaking unraveling of one of the most beloved names in American life. It is not a simple story. It is not a comfortable one. But if you grew up in this country in the second half of the 20th century, it is your story too. Because what happened to Sara Lee happened to a piece of all of us. And most of us never even noticed it was gone until we reached for it one day and found empty air where something precious used to be. Asterisk asterisk, his name wasn't Sara Lee. His name was Charlie Lubin. And if you want to understand what Sara Lee really was, what it meant, what it stood for, why its loss matters, you have to start with Charlie. Because without Charlie Lubin, there is no story. There is no cheesecake. There is no jingle. There is no legacy. There is nothing. Charlie was 14 years old when he put his hands in dough for the first time as a professional. Not as a child helping his mother on a Saturday morning. As a worker. As a young man who had already decided that baking wasn't just a way to earn a living, it was a calling. He left high school behind, walked into the professional baking trade through an apprenticeship, and spent the next 2 decades learning every corner of the craft. The chemistry of yeast. The behavior of butter at different temperatures. The way a cheesecake cracks if you rush it out of the oven too soon. He didn't learn these things from a textbook. He learned them with his hands. By the time Charlie was in his early 30s, the country was still clawing its way out of the Great Depression. Banks had failed. Businesses had shuttered. Families were stretching every dollar until it nearly tore in half. Ambition in that era felt almost indecent, like wanting too much when everyone around you was struggling to get by on enough. Charlie Lubin was ambitious anyway. He and his brother-in-law scraped together $1,500. $1,500 in 1935, and with that, they bought 3 small neighborhood bakeries on the south side of Chicago. Modest places, humble beginnings, the kind of shops where the smell of fresh bread drifted out onto the sidewalk and working people came in to buy something decent for their families without spending money they didn't have. But here's the thing about Charlie Lubin that set him apart from every other baker in America in that era or any other. He refused to cut corners. At a time when your competitor across the street was selling a coffee cake for 29 cents and stuffing it with the cheapest ingredients he could find, Charlie charged 79 cents, nearly 3 times as much. And he filled his products with Greta butter, the finest produced in the country. Fresh cream cheese, real eggs, real bananas. Not imitation banana flavoring from a factory in New Jersey. Actual bananas, peeled by hand, incorporated into the batter because that was the right way to do it. And Charlie Lubin was not interested in the wrong way. When he first walked into the offices of a major Midwest supermarket chain to pitch his products at that price, they laughed at him. Not politely. They laughed. Who was this baker, this small-time South Side operator, coming in here and suggesting they sell his coffee cake for 79 cents when everybody else was doing it for 29? He was, in their opinion, delusional. Charlie walked out of that office. He went back to his bakery. He made his products the same way he always had. And he waited for the world to catch up to what he already knew. It didn't take long. People tasted the difference. Of course they did. When you use real butter instead of a substitute, when you use fresh cream cheese instead of a powder, when every ingredient is the best available version of itself, the person eating that cake knows. They may not be able to articulate it. They may not stand in the kitchen and say, "Ah yes, great butter, I can tell," but their body knows. Their memory knows. And they come back. They always come back. Charlie's 3 bakeries became 5. Then 7. He parted ways with his brother-in-law. Their visions for the future had grown too different to stay in the same room, and set his sights on something that no neighborhood baker had ever seriously attempted before. He wanted to go national. Not just Chicago, not just Illinois, national. He wanted to put his products on tables from Maine to California, from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. He wanted every American family to be able to taste what he had built. He just needed the right product, the right name, the right idea. And in 1949, sitting across from his 8-year-old daughter, he found all 3 at once. His wife Tilly tells the story simply. They were discussing names for a new cream cheesecake Charlie had been perfecting in his home kitchen. He asked Tilly for a suggestion. She offered their daughter's name, half joking. The way you throw out an idea when you're not sure it's serious. ***. Charlie didn't hesitate for a moment. The product had to be perfect, he told his daughter years later, because it was going to carry her name. And he was not going to put his little girl's name on anything less than the best thing he had ever made. Think about that. Sit with it for a moment. A father, a craftsman, a man who had spent his entire adult life learning to make things the right way, named his greatest creation after his daughter because he wanted the quality of his work to be worthy of her. That's not a marketing strategy. That's not a brand identity exercise. That's a man telling the world, in the plainest possible terms, "I stand behind this completely." That was the soul of Sara Lee. Everything that came after every factory, every acquisition, every television commercial, every billion-dollar revenue number was built on top of that one moment. A father, a daughter, a cheesecake, a promise. And the day the people who owned the company stopped honoring that promise was the day Sara Lee began to die. Charlie had the product. He had the quality. He had the name. Now he had a problem that had defeated every baker who had ever dreamed of going national before him. Distance. A cheesecake baked on a Monday morning in a Chicago bakery could not, in 1949, survive the journey to a grocery store shelf in Texas or Georgia or Oregon by the time a customer reached for it on a Friday afternoon. The cold chain, refrigerated trucks, temperature-controlled distribution was not yet what it would later become. Fresh bakery goods traveling long distances arrived damaged, dry, or simply spoiled. And a spoiled cheesecake at 79 cents was not just a lost sale. It was a broken promise. And Charlie Lubin's entire business was built on the idea that he never broke his promise. Most bakers looked at that problem and accepted it as a wall they couldn't climb. You sold locally. You grew regionally. You accepted that national scale was beyond you. Charlie Lubin looked at the same problem and found a door. Aluminum. He developed a process by which his cheesecakes and pound cakes were baked directly inside aluminum foil pans and then immediately frozen, still inside those same pans, and shipped to grocery store freezer cases across the country. The customer would pick up the pan, carry it home, and warm it in their own oven. And what came out the other side would taste, genuinely taste, as though it had been made that morning by a skilled baker who cared deeply about getting it right. The aluminum pan was not just packaging. It was a preservation system, a distribution solution, a guarantee of quality traveling thousands of miles without degrading. It seems obvious now. It seems like the simplest thing in the world. But in 1951, when the all-butter pound cake joined the Sara Lee line, and a beer from Texas tasted it during a visit to Chicago and asked Charlie to ship it south, that simple request opened a door that had never been opened before in the American baking industry. Charlie began franchising delivery routes, first within 300 miles of Chicago, then further still. By 1952, the kitchens of Sara Lee were delivering to all 48 contiguous states. All 48 states. 3 years after a single cheesecake named after a little girl went to market, that first year of standalone wholesale operation, 1951. Charlie started with $21,000 in capital and a production space of 2,000 square feet. His first year generated $400,000 in gross revenue. By 1956, annual sales had reached $9 million. By the time a Time magazine reporter came to profile Charlie and his operation later in that decade, the company had grown to nearly 600 employees, generating more than $30 million a year. The production floor moved 2,400 aluminum pans through its ovens every single hour. Sara Lee had become, by the mid-1950s, the single largest commercial consumer of cream cheese in the United States, the largest beer of fresh bananas, the largest purchaser of Greta butter in commercial quantities anywhere in the country. Let that settle in. A man who started with $1,500 and 3 neighborhood bakeries was now buying more butter than anyone else in America because he refused to use anything less than the best. In 1956, a man named Nathan Cummings came to see Charlie Lubin. Cummings had built something called Consolidated Foods Corporation into one of the largest food enterprises in the United States. He was sharp, ambitious, and he recognized quality the way a good jeweler recognizes a diamond. Not by being told, but by knowing what to look for. He made Charlie an offer. 170,000 shares of consolidated stock, valued at nearly $3 million. Charlie would stay on as president of the Sara Lee division. Nothing would change in how the products were made. He would simply have the resources of an empire behind him. Charlie accepted. And the resources of that empire were about to be used to build something the world had never seen. In June of 1962. Charlie Lubin broke ground on 52 acres of farmland along Waukegan Road in Deerfield, Illinois. A prosperous, quiet suburb. The kind of place where the biggest news of the week was usually a church potluck or a high school baseball game. Nothing out of the ordinary had ever happened in Deerfield. Until now. What rose from those 52 acres over the next 2 years was not simply a factory. It was a cathedral. A monument to American industrial ambition and craftsmanship combined. And the combination of those two things, ambition and craftsmanship, was exactly what Charlie Lubin had always represented: 500,000 square feet of baking, storage, research, and distribution space. Conceived not just as a place to make cheesecakes, but as a complete environment designed around the idea that quality at scale was not a contradiction in terms. Research and development laboratories occupied an entire wing. A test bakery allowed for constant product development and refinement. And in a detail that tells you everything you need to know about how Charlie Lubin thought about his business. The facility included a fully equipped home economics kitchen stocked with every appliance a typical American housewife might own, so that every new product could be tested under real household conditions before it ever reached a store shelf. Not laboratory conditions, home conditions. Because Charlie never forgot who he was cooking for, the ovens ran 100 feet in length. 100 feet. If you stood at one end and watched a cheesecake enter, you would walk the length of a 10-story building laid on its side before you saw it emerge. 40 cheesecakes per row on those conveyor belts, coming out every 30 seconds, golden and perfect. Around the clock, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Walk into that plant when it was running at full capacity, and the warmth would reach you 50 feet from the door, radiating through the air conditioning. Impossible to ignore. The smell, the butter and cream cheese and warm pastry, hung in the air so thick that workers swore they could taste it with every breath. Some of them said they never quite got used to it. Some of them said they never wanted to. And the brain behind it all, the computer system that managed raw material receiving, ingredient formulation, the baking process, palletization, warehouse storage, load dispatching, and shipping, was the most advanced industrial computer installation ever built anywhere on Earth. In an era when most manufacturers used computers to manage a single isolated process, the Deerfield plant used one integrated system to run everything. Analysts from across the country came to study it. 6 years after the plant opened, experts were still writing papers about it, still marveling at what had been accomplished on those Illinois acres. At its absolute peak, the Deerfield facility produced 7.8 million baked items every single week. Not every month. Every week. Think about what that means. Think about how many kitchen tables that fed. How many birthday celebrations? How many Sunday dinners? How many quiet weeknight moments when someone cut a slice of pound cake and everything felt, just for a minute, like it was going to be all right. In 1965, Factory magazine named Deerfield one of the 10 finest new manufacturing plants in the entire United States. In 1985, President Ronald Reagan came in person to walk those floors. A sitting American president, standing where American workers stood every day, looking at what American craftsmanship and ingenuity had built in a suburb north of Chicago. It was one of the great industrial achievements in the history of this country. Not just in the food industry, in any industry, and most Americans have never heard of it, and the ones who built it never got the memorial they deserved. Charlie Lubin retired on August 15, 1965. He was 62 years old. He had started with $1,500 and a refusal to compromise. He left behind a company that was already part of the daily life of millions of American families. A name that meant something. A product that kept a promise. He walked out of that plant and into retirement. And the men who replaced him walked in carrying a very different set of priorities. To be fair, the company continued to grow after Charlie left. The food service division expanded. Sara Lee products reached airlines, hospitals, universities, restaurants. The brand's footprint widened. Television advertising, which Charlie had begun using in 1960, grew more sophisticated, more pervasive, more successful. And then in 1985, something happened that looked like the ultimate tribute to everything Charlie had built. The parent company, Consolidated Foods Corporation, which had owned Sara Lee for nearly 30 years, made an announcement that sent a clear message to the entire business world. It changed its name. Consolidated Foods Corporation became the Sara Lee Corporation, not the company that owns Sara Lee, not the parent of Sara Lee. The Sara Lee Corporation, the single most recognizable name in the portfolio. The name that had come from a little girl's face and a father's commitment to excellence, was now the official name of a $17 billion global enterprise. On the surface, it looked like an honor. It looked like recognition. It looked like the ultimate proof that what Charlie Lubin had built in those 3 neighborhood bakeries on the south side of Chicago had grown into something permanent and magnificent. What it actually was, though no one knew it yet, was the moment the name became more important than what the name stood for, because the Sara Lee Corporation of 1985 was not a bakery that had gotten very large. It was a conglomerate that owned a bakery. It was a collection of acquisitions searching for a coherent identity. And the name Sara Lee was the most recognizable thing they had. So they put it on the front door and hoped that would be enough. It was not enough. Let me tell you what the Sara Lee Corporation looked like at the height of its diversification. Because it is almost impossible to believe unless you see it laid out in plain language. The Sara Lee Corporation simultaneously owned the most beloved frozen dessert brand in America. The one that had started with a little girl's name and a father's pride. A national chain of breakfast sausage products under the Jimmy Dean name. Hillshire Farm deli meats and smoked sausages. The Kiwi Shoe Polish brand, sold in more than 100 countries. Wonderbra, Playtex, the Bra and Girdle Company. Hanes Underwear, Champion Athletic Apparel. DIM, a French hosiery manufacturer. Dim Indeed, Amsbergutter Hotto, a Spanish clothing line. And on top of all of that, coffee brands from the Netherlands, housewares, and personal care products sold across 5 continents. By 1995, annual revenues had reached $17 billion. 149,000 employees worldwide. If you asked a Wall Street analyst in 1995 what Sara Lee was, they would have told you it was one of the most successfully diversified consumer goods companies in the world. A model of strategic breadth. A fortress built from many businesses, each one insulating the others from market turbulence. If you asked your neighbor, if you asked anyone who actually bought things in a grocery store, they would have looked at you a little strangely and said, "Sara Lee, that's the cheesecake, the one with the silver pan." Both answers were technically true, neither one captured the catastrophe that was quietly unfolding, because, while the analysts were admiring the revenue numbers, and the board was congratulating itself on its diversification strategy, something irreplaceable was being lost. The thing that had made the name worth anything in the first place was being diluted, one acquisition at a time, until it was spread so thin across so many product categories that it had almost no meaning left. Charlie Lubin put his daughter's name on a cheesecake because that cheesecake was perfect, because he refused to make it any other way. The name meant, I promise this is the best I can make it. I stake my family's honor on it. What did the name mean when it was sitting next to kiwi shoe polish in a corporate annual report? What did it mean when the same boardroom that signed off on the cream cheese and the Greta butter was also making decisions about European underwear manufacturing? The answer is, it meant less. Every year, a little less, and here is the cruelest part of that story. Nobody meant to do it. There was no villain. There was no moment when someone stood up in a boardroom and said, let's destroy the Sara Lee brand. They were just making what seemed like sensible business decisions: diversify, grow, acquire, expand, protect. The revenue base. They weren't wrong by the standards of their time. They were operating exactly the way major American corporations were taught to operate in that era. They were just wrong about what they actually owned. They thought they owned a brand. They actually owned a promise. And a promise is not something you can leverage, optimize, or diversify your way into growing. A promise only survives if you keep it. Asterisk asterisk in 1990. The last cheesecake rolled off the line in Deerfield, Illinois. There was no ceremony. There was no gathering of the workers who had spent 20 years on those floors. No speech from an executive acknowledging what this place had represented. No moment of collective recognition that something irreplaceable was ending. The decision was announced in the language corporations always use when they want to do something painful without appearing to be doing something painful. Production was being consolidated. Efficiencies were being realized. A newer facility in Tarboro, North Carolina could absorb the workload at a lower cost per unit. Every word of that was true. And every word of it missed the point entirely. Ken Shafaroff had worked at Sara Lee since 1966. He later led a team compiling an internal history of the Deerfield plant, a history that most people outside the company would never read. He described the conveyor belts, the 100-foot ovens, the endless rows of cheesecakes emerging every 30 seconds as the most vivid memories of his entire professional life. He noted, with what you can only imagine was a kind of grief, that the computer systems which had once made Deerfield the most automated factory in the world were, by the time of closure, less powerful than a laptop computer you could buy at any electronics store for a few $100. The same system that had astonished the world in 1964 was laughably obsolete by 1990. Time does that, but here is what time had not done. Time had not erased what those workers had built. Time had not diminished the significance of what had happened in that building for 26 years. Time had not made those 7.8 million baked goods per week any less extraordinary, any less a testament to what American workers could accomplish when they were given the tools and the leadership and the commitment to quality that they deserved. 1,200 people worked in Deerfield when the plant was at its peak. 1,200 families whose lives were built around what happened inside those walls. Men and women who got up every morning and drove to work knowing that by the end of their shift, millions of cheesecakes would have moved through those ovens and begun their journey to kitchen tables across the country. They took pride in that. Of course they did. How could you not? Within 4 years of the plant's closing, all 1,200 of those jobs were gone, not transferred to North Carolina, not relocated, gone. In 1994, the land was sold to a real estate developer. The bulldozers came. The 100-foot ovens, the ovens that a sitting American president had stood beside in admiration, were dismantled and carted away. The computer systems that experts had traveled from across the world to study were decommissioned. The research laboratories, the test bakery, the home economics kitchen, where products were tested against the real standards of real American households, all of it gone. By 2007, even the small Sara Lee bakery outlet store that had kept a tiny physical presence in Deerfield, a place where local residents could still buy the products, could still feel some connection to what the town had once been, closed its doors permanently. The last thread was cut. Today, if you drive north from Chicago on Waukegan Road and turn onto Cates Road in Deerfield, you will find a residential development called Coromandel. Townhomes, parking lots, manicured landscaping, Residents going about their days. There is no historical marker. There is no plaque on the wall explaining what stood here before. The people who live in those townhomes, many of them young families. People who grew up in a world where Sara Lee was already fading from store shelves, have no particular reason to know that they are living on top of one of the great achievements of American manufacturing history. The greatest bakery the world ever built was demolished so quietly and forgotten so thoroughly that most Americans have never heard its name. That is not an accident. That is what happens when a company stops caring about its own story. Of all the chapters in this story, the one that most people live through without realizing it, the one that stings the most, personally, because it happened in plain sight, is the story of what happened to Sara Lee bread. For decades, Sara Lee bread was as American as the families who bought it. It was there on the shelf. It was reliable. It tasted like something a real baker had made, which was the whole point. Which had always been the whole point, going back to Charlie Lubin and his refusal to use anything less than the real thing. In 2011, the Sara Lee Corporation, or what remained of it, having already sold off the underwear and the shoe polish and the European hosiery, sold its entire North American fresh bakery business, not to another American company, to Grupo Bimbo, a Mexican baking conglomerate headquartered in Mexico City. The transaction transferred 41 baking plants, nearly 5,000 distribution routes, the physical infrastructure that had carried Sara Lee bread to store shelves from coast to coast for half a century. Approximately 13,000 employees, people who had built careers in the Sara Lee bakery business, now reporting to a corporation they had never worked for, in a country they did not live in. The price was $959 million, and here is the number that explains everything you need to know about why this sale happened. In the year before the sale, the North American Fresh Bakery Division generated $2.1 billion in net sales, and it produced $38 million in operating income, $30-8 million of profit on $2.1 billion in sales, a margin of less than 2%. For a division that large, operating 41 plants and nearly 5,000 delivery routes, with all the infrastructure and labor and logistics that entails, 2% return was barely justifiable. Some would say it was not justifiable at all. So the sale happened. And on paper, it was rational. On paper, it made complete sense, but paper doesn't shop at the grocery store. Grupo Bimbo had not bought the Sara Lee bread business because they loved the Sara Lee name. They bought 41 plants and 5,000 distribution routes because those assets would double their size in the United States overnight. The Sara Lee brand on fresh bread was, from their perspective, one component of a much larger logistics acquisition. It was not their focus. It was not their priority. Their priority was integration, efficiency, building out their own brand portfolio. Thomas's English Muffins, Arnold Bread, Oro Wheat, Entenmann's. These were the brands Bimbo wanted to grow. So Sara Lee bread, quietly and without announcement, began to disappear from store shelves across the country. It didn't happen all at once. It happened the way an old friend moves away, gradually, and then all at once. 1 week, your grocery store still had it. A few months later, maybe it was still there, but pushed to a different shelf. And then one day you reached for it, and it wasn't there. And there was something else in its place. And you stood there for a moment trying to remember when you'd last seen it. For millions of American families who had bought Sara Lee bread for decades, who had packed it into school lunches for their children, who had made the same Sunday sandwiches they'd been making since the 1970s, the brand simply stopped being there. No farewell. No explanation. Just an empty shelf. Just something familiar. Gone. After the bread was gone. What remained of Sara Lee? The frozen cheesecakes, the pound cakes, the brownies, continued its own journey through a series of corporate owners who each had their own plans, their own priorities, their own ideas about what to do with a name they had inherited but not earned. The Sara Lee Corporation itself dissolved entirely in 2012, split into 2 separate public companies. The frozen bakery products went to a new company called Hillshire Brands. The international coffee and beverage businesses went to a company called De Master Blenders. 1753, the corporation that had once operated in 180 countries and employed 137,000 people simply ceased to exist. Fortune magazine called the split one of the most successful corporate spin-offs in recent memory. They were talking about shareholder value. They were talking about stock performance. They were not talking about what the name had meant to anyone who had grown up with it. Hillshire Brands performed well for about 2 years. Then Tyson Foods, the Arkansas-based chicken processing company, launched a bidding war and acquired Hillshire for $8.5 billion. The Jimmy Dean sausages and the Ballpark hot dogs and the Hillshire Farm deli meats were what Tyson actually wanted. The Sara Lee frozen bakery division came along as part of the package. An inheritance. An afterthought. Nobody in the Tyson boardroom had gone to work that morning thinking about cheesecake. 6 years later, Tyson sold the frozen bakery business to Kohlberg and Company, a private equity firm in New York. Count the owners: Consolidated Foods, Sara Lee Corporation, Hillshire Brands, Tyson Foods, Kohlberg. 5 different owners. 6 decades. And at each transfer, something intangible but irreplaceable was lost. The people who knew why the product was made the way it was made. The people who understood that the Greta butter wasn't a marketing claim, it was a promise made by a father to his daughter. The people who would have looked at a cost-cutting proposal and said, "No, we don't do it that way. That's not what this name means." Those people were gone. Had been gone for a long time. What remained was a label on a product in a freezer aisle. The ghost of a relationship that had once been real. Nobody doesn't like Sara Lee. You remember that jingle. Most of you probably misquote it. Most Americans do, saying nobody doesn't like Sara Lee instead of the double negative original. And the fact that the country got it wrong for 40 years and kept getting it wrong and kept using it anyway because it felt right, that's the measure of how deep it had lodged itself into the American mind. That jingle wasn't just catchy. It was a packed dot. It was a company saying to the American public, "We understand that you have standards. We understand that you expect the best. And we are telling you, in the most direct possible terms, that we will never give you anything less." For 30 years, that pact was honored. Because the people running the company understood what the name carried. They had been in the room when the decisions were made. They had walked those floors in Deerfield. They had tasted what came off those conveyor belts and felt the responsibility of making sure that every one of those 7.8 million items per week lived up to what Charlie Lubin had promised when he named a cheesecake after his daughter Dot. And then the people who understood all of that retired or moved on. And the people who replaced them hadn't been in the room. They had inherited a name, not a philosophy. They had received a brand, not a promise. And a brand without the promise behind it is just letters on a package. Here is what was really lost when Sara Lee was dismantled and distributed among strangers who had other priorities. The proof that quality could win. Charlie Lubin walked into a supermarket beer's office in the 1940s and got laughed at for charging 79 cents when everyone else charged 29. He went back to his bakery, made his products the same way he always had, and waited. And the world came to him. Because quality wins. Not always quickly. Not without difficulty. But quality wins. That story, that proof, got buried under the condominiums in Deerfield and sold in pieces to companies that were thinking about distribution routes and profit margins. Not butter quality. What was lost was the trust when you picked up a Sara Lee cheesecake in 1965 and brought it home. You were trusting that someone had made it the right way, with the right ingredients, with the kind of care that a craftsman puts into something he's proud to put his name on. And that trust was honored every single time. Trust like that is built over decades. It is destroyed in moments, and it is almost impossible to rebuild once it's gone. Because once someone reaches for the product they've trusted their whole lives and finds it changed, finds the texture slightly different, finds the taste not quite what it was, finds the quality somewhere below what the promise implied, they don't make a complaint. They don't call the company. They simply make a mental note. Quiet and permanent. I can't count on this anymore. And they reach for something else. And they never come back. That is what corporate America did to Sara Lee. Not with malice. Not with a single dramatic act of betrayal. With 1,000 small decisions made by people who never understood what they were actually responsible for. There was a moment, a specific, identifiable moment, when all of this could have been stopped. It was the moment when the Sara Lee Corporation looked at its portfolio and saw shoe polish and underwear sitting next to cheesecake and sausage. And instead of asking, "How did we get here? And does this make any sense?" the executives asked, "How do we optimize this for shareholder return?" That was the fork in the road. And they took the wrong path because shareholder return and brand integrity are not always enemies. But they require different kinds of leadership. They require someone who can look at a $17 billion empire and be willing to say, most of this doesn't belong here. We got too clever. We got too far away from what we actually know how to do. That kind of honesty is rare in corporate America. It was rare then. It is rare now. The person who eventually tried to do it was Brenda Barnes, who became CEO of Sara Lee in 2004. She looked at the portfolio with clear eyes and saw the problem immediately. The shoe polish didn't belong next to the cheesecake. The French hosiery didn't belong beside the sausage. She began selling off the non-food businesses, piece by piece, raising more than $3 billion in the process, but the restructuring that was designed to save Sara Lee ultimately revealed something nobody wanted to see. Without the non-food businesses propping up the revenue numbers, the remaining food company was smaller and more vulnerable than anyone had acknowledged. The fresh bread margins were razor thin. The frozen desserts were holding, but the growth wasn't there. And the great name, the name that had been Charlie Lubin's gift to his daughter, had been stretched so thin across so many categories for so many decades that its power to command loyalty had diminished. They had spent the inheritance before they realized it could not be replenished. Take a drive north from Chicago sometime, up Waukegan Road, toward Deerfield. It's a pleasant drive. Prosperous suburbs on either side, corporate campuses and shopping centers, all the comfortable infrastructure of modern American life. Turn onto Kate's Road. Pull over. Look at what's there. Coromandel. A residential community. Townhomes with good landscaping and reserved parking spaces, and residents who bought their homes without any particular knowledge of what stood on that ground before them. 50-2 acres. 500,000 square feet. A 100-foot oven that never went cold for 26 years. A computer system so advanced that experts traveled from across the country to study it. A factory that turned out 7.8 million baked goods every week, every single week, and sent them to the tables of American families from Maine to California. A building where a sitting president of the United States came and walked the floors and was genuinely impressed by what American workers had built. It's all gone. Every bit of it. No marker, no plaque, no acknowledgement that something extraordinary happened here. That the air on this particular 52 acres of Illinois land once smelled like butter and cream cheese and everything warm and good and right about what this country could do when it put its mind to it. The residents of Coromandel drive past every day without knowing, and maybe that's the final lesson in all of this. Not about corporate strategy, not about diversification or brand management or shareholder value. Those are important lessons too, and they're real, and they're worth learning. But the final lesson is simpler than any of that. The things that matter most are the ones we forget to protect. Charlie Lubin knew that. He spent his entire life protecting something. The quality, the honesty, the commitment to using the right ingredients no matter what. He built a company around that protection. He named it after his daughter because he wanted the world to know he was serious. He wasn't making a product. He was making a promise, and when he left, the promise outlived him for a while. Long enough that a generation of Americans built their memories around it. Long enough that a jingle burrowed so deep into the national consciousness that people are still misquoting it 50 years later. But eventually, a promise without a guardian is just a memory. And memories without people to hold them fade. We held this one, you and I, for a long time. The people who remember what Sara Lee really was, what it felt like to bring that silver pan home, what it smelled like when it came out of the oven, what it meant to sit at a table with the people you loved and share something that someone had made with genuine care. We held it. Sara Lee was America at its absolute best. Honest work, genuine quality, a craftsman's unwillingness to give you anything that hadn't been made the right way. What happened to her is America at something less than its best, indifferent, distracted, more interested in the next transaction than in honoring what had already been built, and somewhere in Deerfield, Illinois, underneath the concrete and the landscaping and the parked cars of people who never knew what was there before them, the faint memory of an oven burns. It ran for 26 years. It produced 7.8 million items every week. It fed a nation. It made a generation's sweetest memories real, and it was demolished so quietly that most people never noticed it was gone. That ought to bother us. It ought to bother us a great deal.